In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to use the properties and methods of a thread in order to adjust its life cycle. What is the life cycle of a thread? Well, up to this point in our videos, we've only shown you how to start a thread. But did you know that you could also pause the thread for a period of time, or indefinitely, and then resume it whenever you want to, or even abort the thread? I'm going to demonstrate how to do each of those, and I create a little application to show you how. Let's go ahead and look at the application first and kick it off and let it run. So what I'm going to do is start the thread. It basically will count from 1 to 20,000 and refresh the current number that it's on in this label. I can cause it to sleep, which pauses it for just a few seconds. Or I can suspend the thread from execution and resume it at any time that I wish. Or I can abort the execution of the thread. Are you sure you want to abort this? No. And notice that it continues on. Or I can click yes, and the thread is aborted. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code to do this. It's a pretty straightforward code example. What I've done is create, first of all, a class called threadingExample, and it has two public methods. The first one is a constructor, public sub new, where I grab a reference from the form and keep a private reference to it. And I use that in order to update that label every time I loop from 1 to 20,000. The next is the public sub counter, and this will loop from 1 to 20,000, and then call the display form.update status, and this method simply writes out the current status as we define here in our code to that label on our form. And there's some other code as well in this try and catch that has to do with the abort function, which is a little bit special case, so I'm going to table that discussion just for a moment. We'll come back to that when we get to that point in the presentation. So let's take a look at the code for the form itself. Notice that in the form I've created two private fields, one called example, which is simply a reference to the threading example class, and then the counter thread, which is a private field holding a reference to the thread that we're going to create in our form load. So in the form load, we create a new instance of our example, passing in a reference to the form itself. So this allows the threading example class to be able to call the methods on our form. In particular, it's going to call this public function update status and just update the lbl status.text. And then it also, in the form load, creates a new instance of the thread with the delegate to the example.counter method. When we click the button start, all we got to do, like we've seen in the previous videos, is our counter thread.start, and that kicks off our the counter method, and it begins to count from 1 to 20,000. Let's take a look at some of the other button handlers that we have within our class. We have the btn sleep, which calls the sleep method of the thread, and we pass in the number of milliseconds we want it to sleep. In this case, 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second, I believe. Also, in a like manner, we have counterthread.suspend, which pauses the thread from execution. And what's interesting is this next button. I've actually put a little more thought into this, and probably should do that in the rest of the methods as well, because depending on the current thread state, as we see from the counterthread.threadState property, we'll be allowed to call certain methods or not. So for example, let's run this really quickly, and notice what happens when I click start. And I'm going to click start again, and I'm going to get an exception in my code. And the reason is you can't start a thread that's already been started. It is a thread state exception. So in certain states or in certain stages of a thread's lifecycle, you're allowed to call certain methods, and others you're not allowed to call. So that is why I created this code on the resume button. I begin to check, first of all, whether the thread is alive or not. If it is alive, then there's a certain number of cases that we can check for. If the thread is not alive, then we'll have other thread states that we can check for. So let's start here. If the thread state is running, then exit the sub, because we don't want to resume. It's just like what we did in the start. You can't resume something that's already going. You can only resume it if it's in a suspended state. If we are in a suspended state and somebody clicks the resume button, then we want to call the counter thread.resume method. Likewise, coming down here, if the thread state is currently aborted, then we want to start it up again. Or if the thread state is stopped, then we want to just tell the user that you can't restart a thread that's been stopped. And a stopped state means that the thread has completed execution of the method that you told it to execute. So in this case, when the counter gets all the way to 20,000, it's finished, and so the thread is stopped, and you can't restart it in this manner using the restart at any rate, or the resume. The next one is unstarted. If it's unstarted, go ahead and just start it. So it performs exactly the same as the start method. Finally, we'll take a look at the abort method. Notice we check the thread state. If the thread state is currently running and we click the abort button, then we'll allow the counter thread.abort method to be called. What happens is that an exception gets raised within our method that we can capture and make sure that the user wants to abort the execution of the thread. So notice here, try to display form update status. So from 1 to 20,000, we just continue to call this update status method, which updates our label and puts in the current item from 1 to 20,000 in that string. So that allows us to see the constantly updating label. However, if somebody clicks on the abort button, we call the abort method, then it catches that here, catch E as thread abort exception. And when we do that, what I do is pop open a message box that says, are you sure you want to do this? And if the result is no, then we call a reset abort, which means forget we said anything about aborting. However, if they click yes, then we want to update the status and allow the abort to occur. So you might be wondering to yourself, okay, why would I ever want to use some of these functions like the suspend and the resume and the abort? And I can think of a couple off the top of my head. What if, for example, you had a Windows Forms application and it goes through a lengthy update process and you put a cancel button on a little message box that has the progress bar displaying across the front of it. If the user clicks on cancel, then you'll want to call the abort. You may want to ask, are you sure you want to stop this process? If you do that, you'll lose all the processing that happened up to this point, and the user can make the decision whether to continue the abort or not. Or in the case of the sleeve, suspend, and resume, maybe you need to continue to run a thread, and every so often it needs to check and see if something else has occurred on a different thread or within a different application or in the file system or whatever the case might be. And so you can suspend the thread and allow other parts of code to execute, and then allow it to continue back at a specified amount of time. So there's lots of uses for this, and fortunately you get access to all the items on a thread object that allows you to control its life cycle. Thank you.